So thank you again for being here. And Maria, thank you for joining us. And we've called this evening's event Happiness in Dark Times. And maybe before we come to the dark times we're facing, I thought it might be helpful to hear a little bit more for anyone who hasn't come across your great work before about you, both from the perspective of your experience as a positive psychologist and well-being expert, but also this topic of dark times and what that means to you personally.
Thank you, Mark. And hello to around the world. It's wonderful to see your locations popping up. Yes, I had a childhood that was bookended by loss. A dear grandfather died when I was quite young, and when I was 19-year-old, a dear cousin of mine died, both suddenly, both to cancer. And that set me onto the path of questioning, how do we navigate loss and stay intact? And I found my way into psychology and eventually worked with kids facing life-threatening illnesses. And during that time, got married, had children, then got a divorce. And so I've had a number of moments of profound shifts in my life that have caused my heart to shatter and then attempt to sort of grow and rise through it. So those are the personal roots of this inquiry for me.
Thank you. So I just unmuting myself there. Thanks, Maria. That's great to hear. And I think what I love about your work is it touches on both the science and evidence that we know about what really matters, and we'll talk about that this evening. But it also touches on the human condition and our personal experiences. And I'm looking forward to what you might take us through in terms of practical advice, because a lot of us are facing big challenges in the world right now. So why don't we come on to this idea of dark times, and maybe the obvious place to start is the COVID situation. It's been a crazy few months. Obviously, there were people who were right in the thick of it with, death and loss in some cases, but certainly health challenges and worries about loved ones, loss of jobs, loss of income. But even those of us who aren't affected in that direct way have uncertainty. We have challenging situations with our, work and family balance. We have sort of levels of anxiety, social isolation. There's all kinds of complicated stuff going on. I wondered if you had any reflections on what you've seen during this period and some of the sort of trends and situations that are emerging.
So what makes this time particularly unique is a kind of uncertainty that many of us in our lifetimes haven't seen before. So we have structural uncertainty, right? Our jobs look differently, working from home, schooling looks very differently. There's the structures and systems that had been true are no longer true for most of us. We also have, however, temporal uncertainty, meaning we have no idea what life is going to look like 6 months, a year, 2 years from now. And the combination of those uncertainties laced with the possibility of losing someone we love dearly or of ourselves becoming sick creates this sort of this underground bandwidth in most of us of what we're seeing globally as the highest levels of depression and anxiety and isolative and defensive behaviors than we've seen probably since World War II, and I wasn't alive then.
Yes, it definitely is a challenging time. So I think it's important to sort of hold space for the challenges that people are going through. And one of the critiques of those of us that care deeply about happiness and well-being is that somehow that we're pursuing an agenda that says, let's just focus on what's good, let's just be happy, almost as if it's pushing away negative emotions, challenging situations, loss, heartache, sadness, and so on. And I think one of your real skills is holding the space for that suffering and then finding ways to move forward. So what sort of things have you seen emerging in people you're working with, conversations you've had about that suffering and how it's affecting people? And maybe, because I think it's important that before we start moving on to practical things we can do, we can just be a little bit able to see the reality of that and recognize that there is so much discomfort, sadness, anxiety in the world right now. And actually the fact that even if we're not experiencing that directly, the fact that as global citizens, it's important we sort of lean into that and don't run away from it.
Right. Well, the reality is the most resilient of us find a way to hold both, Mark, find a way to hold that which is difficult, upsetting, distressing, heartbreaking, excruciating, as well as our own capacity to move forward, to grow, to learn, to rise. And so the tools that I'll be teaching in a moment really honor and recognize both sides of our experiences. Look, we are seeing depression and anxiety across age groups that are very concerning to us. The 18 to 29-year-olds and the 30 to 49-year-olds are around the world are suffering. We're seeing physical vulnerabilities in any of us with pre-existing conditions, and those of us who are being asked to be out in public, perhaps more uncomfortably than we would want to be at this time. And with here in the United States, and I assume in Western Europe as well, and Britain, the return to schools is causing incredible worry and distress about how is this going to work? Are we setting ourselves up for failure? Will our children be safe? Does this make any sense at all? So to pull back the deeper curtain, there is always uncertainty in life. We just often have the structures internally and externally that help us navigate that uncertainty with a minor amount of attention, paying attention to it, right? We don't have that luxury now. We have been tossed into the crucible of crisis, many of us, and we are being asked to learn first how to adapt, and then second, how to live with it. And that's where I really want to focus today, is this shift in attention from responsiveness for the first 3 months to now living with it for some time.
Well said. Yeah. So looking forward to coming on to some of those practical steps. But just before we do that, I think it might be worth us recognizing that COVID is happening, of course, but this is not the only challenge that we're facing in our lives. And there are many people very moved and angry about racial injustice, climate change, other challenges in our life. How do we hold that balance between sort of our personal trauma of a difficult day balancing kids and work and being uncertain about our work, and this sort of slightly more existential worries about political leadership, inequality, injustice, and so on? How do you see those as interconnected?
I think there's no way to pretend or deny that they aren't interconnected. I mean, any of us are paying any kind of mindful, conscious attention to the news on any one day, are bombarded with the COVID data, rising infection rates, lack of a current vaccine, shifts in schooling and work still on uncertain ground, and then injustice around the world, right? It absolutely in our face. And then let's just say unskillful, in many cases, political responses to these major considerations. Unskillful is probably the most generous term I can come up with right now. And we know from the science of positive psychology that resilience really rests in our capacity to cultivate what we call a true hope. Greta Thunberg said the most amazing thing at the end of her TED Talk a few years ago, the young climate change activist. She had reached about the 16-minute mark and said, this is the time when most TED speakers will say something hopeful. And she said, I'm not going to do that because, and I love this term, if positive pep talking had made any difference, we would have experienced a difference in climate change, and we haven't. She said, instead, what I will ask of you is action. That through action, we will experience hope. And I think she is 100% absolutely right. Upon each of us now is the response, the requirement of the response that each of us will take individually and then communally to take action that actually sustains us in order that we can sustain the world, however we define the world, whether it's our family, our community, our village, our country, the globe. So the first thing I want to land tonight is this notion that hope is actually cultivated through action. It's not something we're looking to feel or inspire. We're looking to actually experience through watching our feet move in a particular direction.
I really love that. And I love that Greta story. I'd not actually heard that part of her TED Talk. I think that's incredibly wise. And of course, very proud in many ways that our community is called Action for Happiness. This is not about the theory, it's about the action. And what we've learned over many years is that nudging people to take even just a small first step to positive change and a positive response really does make a difference and has a ripple effect in their own lives, but also in the people around them. So I'd love to hear some of your suggestions for practical action. I know you've got a few lined up. So where would you like to start?
I do have a few lined up. And so number one, absolutely mandatory in a time of trauma, crisis, and sudden abrupt upheaval is self-care. Now, self-care is not something I usually start when I teach resilience. I don't usually start with self-care. It's usually woven in toward the end as a sort of gentle reminder. In this moment, everywhere I teach, this is where I'm beginning, because the burden on us and the overwhelm is experienced daily and profoundly. And in order to cultivate whatever we're here to cultivate, I'm seeing in the chat concerns about political systems, injustice, animal rights, climate change. We are putting our attention on the largest issues of our time. And in order to actually move positively, to make positive change in those broad arenas, we have to be prepared internally. So I want to offer just 3 simple self-care driving questions that I invite you to start the day with. This is about as elemental as it gets. Number 1, what can I do today that will nourish me? What can I do today that will strengthen me? And what can I do today that will inspire me? Now, I'm not inviting anybody to take entire day after day after day practicing self-care, although that would be lovely. What I am inviting is that you begin to think of your day as the opportunity to put yourself in your own good hands for a few moments each day. What might inspire me, strengthen me, or nourish me today? And by nourish, I mean calm and soothe, right? Those of us who give ourselves a small percentage of every day on behalf of our own well-being have the fortitude and the internal resources to face whatever overwhelm or stressors we're facing. So that's the first practice, Mark. Does that make sense to you?
It really does. And it reminds me of that lovely phrase, which we were discussing with Kristen Neff recently, about you can't pour from an empty cup. If we really care about others, we have to start by nurturing ourselves. So, is your suggestion that we sort of we reflect on those questions that you mentioned each day? How would you put that into practice, ideally?
Yeah. I have a notepad near my bed on the bed table, and it has those 3 questions. So when I wake up first thing in the morning and I reach for my phone, which we all do, many of us do, I see those questions and I'm reminded, and I only choose one. You don't have to choose all 3, choose one and practice that mindfully or consciously just for a few moments that day. What we are cultivating here is the stance of personal leadership. Resilience rests on the choices that we make that remind us that we have the choice to shape our day. I don't have the choice. I cannot control how my mother is doing 2,000 miles away in the south of the United States. I cannot control what the political leadership in my country is doing or not doing on behalf of our own well-being. I have almost no control over where this virus is going now. I do have control, and this is the control we most need, over how I shape my day, how I respond to the stressors in front of me. Self-care is the number 1 practice, resilience-based practice to start with now, because this is a marathon. And this might even be a marathon upon a marathon upon a marathon.
Indeed. So can you remind us of the 3 questions, just so people can sort of make sure they've got that in their minds?
Yes. What will nourish me today? What might strengthen me today? What might inspire me today?
So if you don't mind me making this personal, when you woke up this morning, and I know this is part of your practice, what was today's particular reflection for you on one of those questions?
Yeah. So I was going for inspiration today, and I have one of my favorite practices. Long ago, one of my resilience practices is I stop watching the news at night. I don't watch it at night because then I can't sleep and I go to bed agitated. Turns out it doesn't help. So I began a practice many years ago of looking for inspiring videos. And this morning, I was so excited about the work that we're doing today that I thought, I want that feeling again. I want that feeling of inspiration. And so I spent some time on YouTube looking for music compilations, inspiring talks, etc.
Great. And I know you've got a potential video hopefully lined up for us later in this session, so I'm looking forward to that. I've just seen a couple of really helpful ideas actually in the chat, particularly about this, now having a question or a reflection at the start of the day, and how can you link it to something that's part of your routine? So I think the suggestions were when you're boiling the kettle for a cup of tea or when you're brushing your teeth. And there's something really clever behaviorally in that, which is it's a thing you do every morning anyway. Can you link it to a new habit like reflecting on something that you will nourish you or inspire you? I think that's a really wise. So thank you, community, for suggesting that. Let's move on, because I know you've got more ideas. What's next on the list?
Yes. So the second thing I want to bring us to is a technique to help reduce the spinning in our minds. So just quickly, I just want you to say yes or no to the following questions. In the last 5 months, have you ever jumped to a conclusion? Just type in yes or no in the chat. In the last 5 months, has anybody taken anything personally? Or have you catastrophized?
I'm seeing the most amazing array of yeses appearing in the chat feed.
Across the globe, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So these are 3 of the common negative thought habits that we have as human beings. Now, what's important to know is that we all have them. We all jump to conclusions. We all take things personally. We all catastrophize. Clifford says that pretty much sums up my life. We all maximize negative input coming our way and minimize the positive. We all have our emotions cloud our judgment. Sometimes some of us blame and shame. We externalize. We don't take responsibility. Now, we don't have all of them. We tend to be more vulnerable to some than others. I'm a little more vulnerable to taking things personally and jumping to conclusions. That's just me. The Dalai Lama has these, Thich Nhat Hanh has these, Malala has these, Mother Teresa had them. They're just normal because our brains are hardwired for anxiety and fear. Fair enough. We need brains hardwired in this way in order to survive. However, resilient folk do their best to not stay stuck in the spinning of jumping to a conclusion. So for example, before COVID-19, I might have felt guilty that I wasn't doing enough taking care of my children because I was so focused on work. I might have felt that way. During COVID-19, if something triggers and I start to feel guilty, like, oh my God, I forgot to buy food for the young adults sheltering in my house, or I didn't finish the laundry I promised my daughter, that guilt feels like a mountain. It suddenly becomes huge. Why? Because I'm already in a state of distress often. So now I've got the negative thought triggering deeper, even deeper distress. Now my guilt feels dangerous. It actually feels like if I don't fix this, I'm going to lose my relationship with my daughter. So an emotion triggers this crazy thinking, which then triggers usually very bad behavior. I isolate, I defend, I attack. Again, normal. We don't want to spend time spinning in these negative thought habits. So I want to teach you a very quick, simple tool based on what Tal Ben-Shahar, a thought leader in our field, calls the genius of the and. I'm going to type in the and. And it looks like this. You have a negative thought about yourself or about the world. I'm not doing enough. That's the thought I have pretty much every other day here during COVID-19. I'm not doing enough. I'm not doing enough to fix the world. I'm not doing enough to take care of my customers. I'm not doing enough to build new business. I'm not doing enough to take care of the cat and the dog. And I'm certainly not doing enough for the 20-year-old in my house, right? I'm not doing enough. So you want to name out loud the negative, distressing thought that you're having. Some of you might be feeling, I'm feeling guilty about the goodness in my life. We have been witnessing profound stories of injustice around the globe and poverty and the unfairness of the disease as it hits certain populations, of brutality from some of our law enforcement officials. And so we feel guilt. I have a roof over my head. I have food. I have a job. I feel guilty about the goodness in my life, right? And so those are 2 examples of the kinds of negative thoughts, catastrophizing, taking things personally that I might be having. What you want to do is name them and then write the word and, literally write the word and. And on the other side of the and, what we want to write are sentences or phrases rather that are both positive and true. Now, by positive, I don't mean Disney, fantasy, Hollywood positive. I mean slightly positive. And by true, I mean true to us. We know them to be true inside of ourselves. So for me, it might look like I'm not doing enough. And I know that every day I do my best. And I can chip away at the big things. And I'm worthy anyway. That's a Brene Brown phrase, right? I believe these. I believe these. I believe that I can chip away. I believe that every day I'm doing my best, and I believe that I'm worthy. Those are true. So yes, you're creating a distance, Sarah, between the negative thought habit that gets triggered very easily in a time of distress. You're building in an and, which is an integration word. Notice we're not telling ourselves, don't think those thoughts. We're saying, have the thoughts, but don't stay stuck there. I have them, and now I'm going to bring my mind. This is what Karen Rivich at Penn calls building cognitive flexibility. I'm going to bring my mind to a more flexible, slightly more positive place.
I think that's really powerful, Maria, because there's a danger that we slip into this sort of cult of positive thinking where there's kind of a bit of sort of self-help literature that says, just wish for things to be better and they will be, and sort of focus on only the good stuff. And I think that doesn't really cover the reality of our human condition. So what I love about what you've shared there is, first of all, the normalization to remember that the Dalai Lamas of this world also experience inner doubt. It's we're very prone to feeling that this voice in our head is unique to us, but actually it's a common human experience. But also the fact that you can hold space for that difficult experience and focus on something different. So I find that really powerful. Thank you.
Yeah. And with the bigger, very painful thoughts, like I have failed this person, or I have really let someone down. We may not be able to get to the positive responses right away. That's okay. I just want you to live with the and for a while. Like I will literally pace my bedroom and sometimes it takes moments, sometimes it takes days to get to the and that's okay, because what we're training ourselves to do again is to stand in this place of personal responsibility and personal leadership where we hold ourselves accountable for the quality of our thinking. We're not asking our brains to not think negative thoughts, because that would be denial and ridiculous. We're holding ourselves for keeping our brains as healthy as possible to the best extent we can.
Before we move on to your third point, I feel the need to bring in the fact that, let's say somebody is dealing with a really extreme situation, like the loss of a loved one. I know you've experienced that in your own life, a real serious trauma that's leading to grief and genuine darkness in someone's life. You said something at the event when we were together, which is, I may be paraphrasing, but you said something like, even on the darkest day, there's still a best moment, or something like that, which gave me this idea that of cultivating hope even in the face of dark times. It is what you've just said about the and, something we can practice even when we're facing those most extreme of situations, the loss of a loved one, the terminal diagnosis. I'm going into really extreme territory, but there are genuinely people who are experiencing that, that kind of adversity all around us. Do you find that, have you personally found that that's still possible to find hope in those dark times?
I have, and I want to tie a few threads together now, because I'm noticing some reflections in the chat around loss, but also around profound loneliness and isolation, which is its own sort of particular grief and experience of loss. So when we look at the anecdotal tales of those in the worst circumstances, like Nelson Mandela in jail for 27 years, or Anne Frank in the attic, hiding from the Germans, or stories of men and women who have suffered greatly over long periods of time. The resilient stories have this thread of the and in them. In other words, I'm facing the darkness as best as I can, and I'm turning my attention whenever possible toward the good. What enables us to do that is a perspective that honors and recognizes that every single day there is darkness and there is light present. There is horrific behavior activated by human beings and astonishingly generous and beneficent behavior activated by human beings. Both are true every day. And resilient folk learn to hold this gaze of wholeness, if you will, honoring and respecting both, and then choosing when they need to sort of bring themselves up in the day, choosing to move toward the positive, the light, the good. The day my younger brother died, he was 48, I was 50. He had been ill for 10 weeks, and then we lost him suddenly. There was a best moment that day. And that, in fact, that's a practice I can teach you in a minute. The day of my divorce after a 20-year relationship, there was a best moment that day. The day COVID-19 hit and my traveling business, which was the bulk of my business, disappeared overnight, there was a best moment that day. Now, some days the best moments are as simple as seeing the butterfly on the fence outside my deck, or the blueberry that someone gave me, the blueberry muffin that someone gave me. Some days the best moments, of course, are going to be more profound, more potent. But when you learn to soften your gaze and look for the good, you will find it. And over time, it begins to nourish you. So knowing that most resilient people are actually quite skillful at honoring the good while managing the bad, I now not only know that the butterfly is going to show up somehow in some form, or the blueberry muffin, or a kind word from someone in the audience, that there will be a good moment. And there only going to be one, but there will be one on any day.
Thank you. So wise. And then was there a final practice you wanted to leave us with as well before we move to some of the questions from this lovely audience?
So best moment of the day, by the way, is a practice I encourage you to do at night. Just as you're getting ready to go to sleep, ask yourself, what was the best moment of the day? Savor it for a few moments. And do that maybe for 30 nights in a row. Because again, you're training your mind and your heart and your gaze to orient toward the good. You will find every day over 30 days, there will be a best moment. The last thing I want to bring in, it has to do with this notion of progress. One of the distressors, I think I just made that word up. One of the stressors that we're all experiencing is this feeling like every day's Monday, and I'm overwhelmed, and I'm bored at the same time, and I'm frightened, and I'm anxious, and I'm exhausted. I'm feeling all of that at the same time. And I don't know that it's going to be any different a month from now, or 2 months from now, or 6 months from now. So there's this kind of swirl of gray fog, if you will, internally and externally. One of the ways that we begin to develop the fortitude within to persevere over time, which we must, that's the resilience invitation, to persevere over time, is to celebrate what Teresa Amabile from Harvard calls celebrate small gains. To take a moment, maybe every day or every other day, to step back and say, what progress have I made? What gains have I made? How have I shifted things even slightly in a slightly better direction? And mark that progress down. What this activates within families and teams and communities is the recognition that we may not be where we want to be, but we are on our way. And that elevates perseverance, it elevates optimism, and it elevates that motivation and determination to hang in there. So, best moment of the day at night, during the day celebrating small gains, throughout the day the and begin the day with those 3 self-care questions.
What a fantastic program for happiness in challenging times. That's brilliantly helpful. Now we've had all kinds of wonderful questions, but and I want to bring some of them in. But I know you have been moved by one of the videos, inspiring videos you'd seen. Why was that on your mind? And would you like to introduce it for us?
So what I'm wrestling with is how personal to get. So I have a mind that left to its own devices defaults to anxiety. I default to worry and rumination. And if I don't actually consciously remind myself that I have a choice of where I put my attention, then on my own, I create a world that feels darker rather than lighter. Emerson said it this way: to different minds, the same day is a hell or a heaven, right? I can experience the same day either as hell or heaven by choosing where I put my attention. You all know now that I don't watch the news at night because it triggers my anxiety. Don't want to go to sleep that way. So I look for beautiful videos. Now, not so long ago, during COVID, one of your British poets and storytellers, Thomas Roberts, decided he wanted to do something to help himself feel better and also help his younger brother and sister feel better. And so he took this time of COVID to write a poem, a tale, if you will, almost a fairy tale, but it's also a poem story about the hindsight we could be developing even while we're in the middle of 2020. It's called The Great Realization. It has gone global, viral, which I'm so grateful for. I'm going to play it now for you. And what I would love for you to be thinking about as you're enjoying Tomas's creativity is notice how he lives in the and of acknowledging that which is dark and that which is light. Notice also how he is doing what Greta Thunberg asked us to do, which is to cultivate hope by taking action. He didn't just sit in his bedroom and feel miserable about COVID-19. He didn't just watch his younger brother and sister be sad and worried. He actually took action to create at least a moment of sanctuary for them and for all of us. So let me play that for a moment now, and then Mark will come back for some questions.
Tell me the one about the virus again, then I'll go to bed.
But my boy, you're growing weary, sleepy thoughts about your head.
Please, that one's my favourite. I promise just once more.
Okay, snuggle down, my boy, though I know you know full well. The story starts before then, in a world I once would dwell. It was a world of waste and wonder, of poverty and plenty, back before we understood why hindsight's 2020. You see, the people came up with companies to trade across all lands, but they swelled and got much bigger than we ever could have planned. We'd always had our wants, but now it got so quick. You could have anything you dreamed of in a day, and with a click. We noticed families had stopped talking. That's not to say they never spoke, but the meaning must have melted, and the work-life balance broke. And the children's eyes grew squarer, and every toddler had a phone. They filtered out the imperfections, but amidst the noise, they felt alone. And every day the skies grew thicker, till you couldn't see the stars. So we flew in planes to find them, while down below, we filled our cars. We'd drive around all day in circles. We'd forgotten how to run. We swapped the grass for tarmac, shrunk the parks till there were none. We filled the sea with plastic, because our waste was never capped, until each day when you went fishing you'd pull them out, already wrapped. And while we drank and smoked and gambled, our leaders taught us why. It's best to not upset the lobbies. More convenient to die. But then in 2020, a new virus came our way. The governments reacted and told us all to hide away. But while we all were hidden, amidst the fear and all the while, the people dusted off their instincts. They remembered how to smile. They started clapping to say thank you and calling up their mums. And while the car keys gathered dust, they would look forward to their runs. And with the skies less full of voyagers, the earth began to breathe, and the beaches bore new wildlife that scuttled off into the seas. Some people started dancing, some were singing, some were baking. We'd grown so used to bad news, but some good news was in the making. And so when we found the cure, and were allowed to go outside, we all preferred the world we found to the one we'd left behind. Old habits became extinct, and they made way for the new, and every simple act of kindness was now given its due.
But why did it take a virus to bring the people back together?
Or sometimes you've got to get sick, my boy, before you start feeling better. Now lie down and dream of tomorrow and all the things that we can do. And who knows, if you dream hard enough, maybe some of them will come true. We now call it the Great Realization. And yes, since then there have been many. But that's the story of how it started and why hindsight's 2020.
Because if you look at the camera, they know someone's filming it because they can see you.
Exactly. If you look at the camera, they know someone's filming it. Okay, lie back down.
Wait, can I just practice right now?
Yes.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Thank you, Maria. That was really moving. I did watch that earlier in lockdown, but I'd forgotten, and it really chimes with a theme we've had coming up a lot around waking up to what really matters. This lockdown has been a bit of a wake-up call to us about reframing our priorities, and many of the questions Action for Happiness community have been asking for years have become much more profound. So I'm really grateful for you sharing that. What was on your mind in terms of takeaways from that, apart from the obvious message that this could be a chance for something different?
What I appreciated about it was his choice as a creative person to create something that would be nourishing for his younger brother and sister, and also nourishing for himself. So he dove into the best of himself, which is his creative talent, to take the very moment and not deny how horrific this is and not stay stuck in the horror of it. So very, very grateful for the choice to take care of those he cared for closely on behalf of their own well-being, which is all we can do, right? That is what we can do, is repair the world that is right in front of us, and in so doing, bring something beneficent to the world.
Thank you. So let's move on to questions. There's so many lovely responses to that and everything you've said in the chat. And so just to let you know, folks, that we will try to capture the chat and share it in our follow-up email tomorrow, in case you'd like to revisit some of the helpful links and ideas and responses that Maria has shared and others have shared. I'm turning now to the Q&A, and thank you for all the questions. The first thing I wanted to share actually isn't a question, but I think it just really highlights just the power of what you've said with us this evening, Maria. So Julia has shared this: I lost the love of my life 8 weeks ago. Wow, Julia. And I feel devastated, but I want to honor our totally amazing 30 years together. I am so blessed. And I think that's just such a, I mean, tragic, but beautiful example of the and. This is awful. And yet it's a chance to recognize that blessing. So I just wanted to sort of share what Giulio has put, because I just think that's such a lovely example of what you've been talking about.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I'm so sorry. I am so sorry that life has brought you this sorrow in the midst of this time, and how astonishing your own capacity to build something beautiful even in the presence of that heartbreak. Thank you.
So now we've got a couple of questions from anonymous attendees, which I think reflect a little bit of the sort of quite severe challenges many of us can face. So one has asked, I sometimes get triggered by PTSD from a difficult childhood, and I might spend the day in a panic attack, which is deeply painful. Any suggestions?
Well, to recognize that those of us who've had traumatic experiences in the past, when faced with new trauma, often do get triggered. So as painful as that is, I do want to put it in a somewhat normal context. And again, I am so sorry that this moment is triggering that for you. One of the beautiful approaches that resilient folk take is, in a moment of calm, so when you're not feeling panicked, to do some reflection on, when I've had panic in the past and I've handled it well, what were the elements of that success? You see, success is not accidental. So when we navigate difficult moments well, we want to hold on to our wisdom and bring it into the present moment. So we call this mining the gold for the in the past to inform the present. So I would invite you to do that, is to do some journaling about what worked well in the past when I had panic, and how can I bring that forward to the present.
Thank you. And another very simple, but I think really important question, again, anonymous. Someone's just asked, why do some people just wake up feeling sad? And I think it's important to acknowledge the fact that, you know, none of us choose to feel a certain way. Nobody chooses to feel low or depressed or anxious. And of course, there are both environmental and genetic and hormonal reasons for our mood and so on. And what's your response to that? You know, very simple but very important question.
So I have a few answers. First, neurochemistry is always involved. Some of us literally just have neurochemicals and hormones that lean us in one direction or another: sad, happy, pessimistic, optimistic, anxious, calm, etc. So biology, physiology matters, number one. Number two, some of us are in situations personally before COVID-19, during COVID-19, that are sad, that would make anyone sad. And number three, we are in a time of global heartbreak, of global sorrow. I would suggest that any of us who have an open heart and an open mind are experiencing sadness on a regular basis. This is a norm of this time. And we simply want to acknowledge that, not make it worse than it is, but nor try to pretend it shouldn't be so. Sadness is a normal response to a pandemic.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. Thank you. Michelle has asked an important question about the dark times that our loved ones, and particularly children, might be facing. So she said, how do we help our children through the dark times? My 11-year-old daughter has been through trauma witnessing domestic abuse. Since COVID, she feels more desperate and anxious, alone and isolated. How can we help them feel there is light in the future?
So with children, it's important to take every day as an opportunity to create a better moment. Some of the pressures we put on ourselves as parents is to be there all the time, to be wise all the time, to do the right thing all the time. It's simply impossible. It's just impossible. However, we can create what we call better moments. So to be thoughtful about, what could I do today, just today? Well, it's evening for you. So let's say tomorrow. What could I do tomorrow? Just one moment in which I provide for my daughter or my son a moment of hope, a moment of uplift, a moment of laughter, a moment of calmness, a moment of serenity. You know, whatever you feel as the parent is probably the most useful, nourishing experience for them to have. And with the children who can articulate what they want and need, you know, you can co-create the moment with them. Presence is felt in moments. And so wise parents will often look at the day and say, well, I can't really offer much during the, but at that time of the day, I can be fully present. What could we do together? What would be meaningful to you? So you want to build in this notion of better moments, number one. And number two, every tool that I taught tonight, and any of the, like Kristen Neff's self-compassion work, the other speakers you've had on, your greatest chance of integrating that into the people you love, and I know that there was some stuff in the stream about spouses and parents and siblings who are negative and pessimistic or anxious or frightened of death, etc. Any positivity that you want to help cultivate in another is best done by living and modeling it yourself, and inviting them to sort of be on the journey. I'm doing this thing called Best Moment of the Day every night. Do you want to participate with me? Or I'm going to do one thing to strengthen myself today. What might you do? Don't force them, but invite them on the journey with you.
Let's move on to the theme of action again in some ways. So someone said, well, great webinar so far. Thank you for that comment. Feeling rather lonely at the moment, even though I know I have friends and family and I know all the right type of things to do, like CBT, mindfulness, exercise, positive outlook. So all the theories there in this case, but they say my head's stuck. I don't want to be down, but for some reason I can't seem to take the positive actions I need to move forward. Any ideas on how I can give myself the kick to feel better again? So I guess even if we're hearing all your great suggestions this evening, for some of us it's quite hard to find that motivation or to sort of to nudge ourselves into acting on it. Any thoughts on that?
Yes, and I'm seeing in the chat that there are some people who are experiencing this similar thing. So first, we have to give ourselves permission to feel what we feel, permission to feel stuck, permission to not want to get out of bed, permission to wake up with sorrow, permission to be afraid of the next day. So We don't want to deny ourselves our human experience, permission to be where you're at. And I'm wondering, this is Kristen Neff's work, I'm wondering what self-compassion as the first step might afford you in terms of then building enough kindness, which will build some energy within you to take these other steps. So I think self-compassion is your first number one approach, which starts with permission. Permission, can you forgive yourself for being human and feeling what you feel? One of the dangers, Mark, of me showing up as a presenter, you know, I've got my hair combed, I have a makeup on, I actually put a proper top on, you know, like one of the dangers is that people project on me that this is how I look every day. And no, I lost Monday, a week ago Monday, I buried one of my oldest friends who died of cancer. And none of this was available to me last week. None of it. I had canceled all the webinars. I allowed myself to do the deep grieving. I forced myself to go on walks because I knew they would help me and remind me that there's a larger world out there. So any projection you might have that Mark or myself or any of the other speakers aren't experiencing what you are experiencing, please let that go. We are all human together. And my capacity to show up for you today rested on my permission I gave myself last week to fall apart for a while and grieve the fact that I was not able to say goodbye to someone I loved. I was not able to hold him, not able to see him face to face. And I will live with that. And like the caller earlier on, and I am determined to grow meaning out of the love we shared anyway.
Wow, Maria, I'm so sorry for the loss of your friend, and I'm so grateful that, for first of all, you can share that with us, but also that you're able to be here to share all this wisdom at such a raw time. And you know, I think that again was just a stunning example of that idea of that holding that difficulty and seeing the love that you and your friend shared and how much that means. I'm sort of tempted to move on to this question by Bethan, because it relates to that sort of loss, but it rather than looking through the lens of that lovely example we heard from Julia and your own example there, which is very raw and fresh. Bethan says, I too lost my late mum and still struggles our bond, and was so close. 2 years, I guess it's 2 years ago since that happened. So this is, you know, grief obviously takes time, but obviously this is a much longer time after that loss. Bethan says, I still have dark days. I struggle with the sadness overwhelming at times, high stress and anxiety. More calm would help. So I think just to sort of recognize that this doesn't immediately go away, you know, as we acclimatize to this loss stays with us. Have you got any thoughts on that and how grief changes with time, maybe?
So I've stopped talking about resolving grief or healing grief or recovery from loss, and really think now about grief as something that becomes integrated into our living. And there are days when the grief feels more extreme and profound. My brother Johnny died in 2011, and there are still moments that take me to my knees when I realize he is never going to see his daughters married. He won't be there. He's not going to be there for my birthday in the fall. Like, there are moments when the grief is acute. However, even in its acuteness, it feels different than the 2 months after he passed or the week after he passed. And so the invitation with grief is to see it as something that over time becomes threaded into your living, and it's the intensity of it will rise and fall. And it's not about moving on or past or recovering from. It's really this notion of weaving and integrating. I hope that's helpful for you. And the last thing I want to say about that is there is no time. There is no time frame to grief. I get to love my brother, my friend Ellie, who just died. I get to love them the rest of my life. And because I will love them the rest of my life, I will feel pain about their loss the rest of my life. Both are true. Loving what is mortal brings us into the territory of sorrow and suffering.
It is the human condition, and it's both joyful and painful in parallel. Thank you, Maria. I want to move on to a question from Janet, which reflects something I'm seeing a lot in this community about not just interest in our own well-being, but deep care and concern for others. So this is just one example of, I think, many people expressing this idea of wanting to help others in difficult times. Janet's asked, how do you help a family member who's been depressed and on medication, in this case, but the thought of living on medication makes them more depressed. But I think maybe there's a more general question here about, if we know and love others dealing with dark times, we obviously can't change them, but we can help them. What would you suggest to bring some of this wisdom to our relationship with people in need?
So, I think once our natural approach is to show up with solutions, right? Let me help you get some medication. Let me help you get into therapy. Let me help you with a coach. Let me help you. Do you want to take a daily walk? Do you want to exercise with me? And those are beautiful. And it's like helping coach someone into a better place. Having said that, not everyone is on the same rhythm or path or journey that we want them to be on, nor are they sometimes capable of it. And so then the stance of loving kindness becomes simply that, loving, kind presence. So I try to invite in myself and in others this balance between offering to do on behalf of and offering to be with, and checking in with them. Is it more helpful today if I simply be with you in the swamp? Or would you like me to help sort of build a bridge out of the swamp? What serves you? That is the most respectful stance to take. It's not always easy, however. And back then to our first point, if you are in relationship with, or work closely with, or care deeply for someone who is suffering greatly, self-care is going to be mandatory for you. So you have the energy to continue to be both present and perhaps constructive and helpful over time.
Thank you. We haven't got very much time left, and there's so many wonderful questions. Thank you again, everyone, for all of your contributions and lovely comments. I wanted to move on to the theme of guilt. There's a question from Sarah, which I'll read out in a moment, but I think there's a general point here about guilt, which is right now, and my colleague Alex mentioned this when we spoke the other day, that we're all aware of this sort of huge amount of suffering going on around us. And so sometimes in our own lives, when we're dealing with what seems like a minor thing, but it's very real to us, a frustration with our children and balancing home life, or the worries we have about how our colleagues behaving, and then we sort of feel a bit guilty for worrying about it because there are other people who are facing really severe challenges. So I think there's a question here about dealing with guilt for all of us, even in our sort of what you might call day-to-day life. But Sarah's got a really quite specific and quite extreme example. She says, I caused the end of my 20-year marriage and cannot get past my regret and my guilt, the impact on several lives forever. The guilt that I feel I destroyed my children's family. It's been 4 years and I'm still deeply sad and struggle to feel any self-worth. So that's a quite extreme example of guilt. But I think there's something here we all experience that sort of feeling to some extent. What are your thoughts on guilt and how to respond to it in a constructive way?
So there's some literature on the difference between good guilt and bad guilt. And I have to admit, I'm not up to speed on that literature. I just want to mention it as for those of you who like reading about topics like this. With any of the emotions that we tend to name or experience as negative, this is where building in that and is so useful. I'm having a hard time forgiving myself, and I can take one step today to better my relationship with my daughter. I'm feeling horrific about the fact that I have a roof over my head and food and a job. And I know people just down that street who are facing food insecurity, and I haven't fed them yet. And I can make a choice today about how I show up in the world. So here's where the and is really useful, both on micro and macro experiences.
We're just a few minutes from the end, Maria. So I think much as I'd love to continue these questions and conversations, I'd like to sort of give you a chance really to reflect on this whole conversation. I'm so grateful for you being here. I find it really moving and very profound, and I can see in the chat that so many people are hugely appreciative of your openness and honesty and wisdom. So it's been a real pleasure. Did you have any sort of final reflections or thoughts on this whole topic of both happiness, but also the kind of reality of the dark times that we face in our lives?
Absolutely. So a couple of practical things. We'll get a recording, and the video is captured in the recording. But if you want the video, I know a number of people were typing about that. You can just go to YouTube, the great realization. Just that, and it'll pop up. It's everywhere. One of the things that I do to keep myself going is look for stories of exemplars. And there is a community in England, and I believe the town is called Eames, even though it's spelled Eyaams, in the north of England, that is an exemplar village for all of us. Because you see, during the time of the bubonic plague in 1665, the townspeople of Eames saw that they were in danger. The plague had decimated Europe, was heading through the south of England and heading north. And they made a decision as a community to gather together one day, and under the guidance of their rector, they stepped into astonishing courage. And they determined that they were going to meet the plague by standing in a stance of communal and personal leadership, bringing the best of themselves forward. The decision they made was to build a wall of border stones around the town called boundary stones, big stones. In the stones, they drilled holes. They put coins in the holes and put vinegar on the coins, thinking that it would protect the coins from the bubonic plague. And they asked the tradespeople to come up to the village border, leave goods and food, take the coins, but not enter the village. Because you see, the determination they made was that no stranger would be caused harm by someone in the village, and that anyone in the village who contracted the plague would die in the arms of someone they knew, someone they loved. During the 14 months that the plague swept through the village, 2/3 of the village died, but they died knowing that they caused harm to no stranger, and that they were being cared for by someone they knew or someone they loved. We are astonishing in our capacity as individuals and as communities to be the best of ourselves in the worst moments. This is the essential resilience question. Who might I be at my best in this difficult, even horrific time? The practices I've shared with you today will help you get there bit by bit, day by day.
Maria, I don't think I really want to add anything to that, because that's such a beautiful and profound way to leave this evening's session. So just to say, well, first of all, a big thank you to everyone who's participated this evening for all the questions, the comments. Really grateful, but particularly grateful for you, Maria, giving this time, especially given what you shared about your recent loss. And your wisdom and your energy and your courage is inspiring to all of us. So we're so grateful for you being here, and thank you everyone for being part of this, and we look forward to seeing you again for another one of these inspiring conversations very soon. Thanks, Maria. See you again soon.
Thank you all. Thank you. Goodbye. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you so much.